These are the 7 deadliest pandemics in human history. Outbreaks so catastrophic, they didn't just kill millions. They reshaped civilizations, toppled empires, and at their worst, wiped out entire continents of people. And the terrifying part is, scientists say the next one could be worse. To understand how disease has shaped the human story, we need to go back nearly 1,500 years, to the height of the Byzantine Empire. The year is 541 AD. Emperor Justinian I rules over one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. Constantinople is a jewel of the ancient world, and then something arrives in the grain ships from Egypt: rats, fleas. And inside those fleas, a bacterium that would later be named Yersinia pestis. The Plague of Justinian tore through Constantinople with staggering speed. At its peak, the disease was killing between 5,000 and 10,000 people per day in the capital alone. Historians estimate the total death toll reached somewhere between 25 and 100 million people, roughly a quarter of the entire world's population at the time. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague. He survived. His empire did not, at least not in the way it existed before. The plague is now considered a major factor in the decline and eventual fall of the Roman Empire. And it didn't just strike once. It kept returning in waves for over 200 years, from 541 all the way to roughly 750 AD. Some scholars have pushed back on these numbers, arguing that the highest estimates rely on a narrow set of historical texts and aren't fully supported by archaeological evidence like coins, inscriptions, or pollen records. But the consensus remains clear. This was one of the most devastating events in ancient history, and the bacterium behind it wasn't finished. 800 years later, the same pathogen returned. This time, it was worse. The Black Death arrived in Europe around 1347, likely carried along trade routes from Central Asia. One of the most chilling origin stories involves the siege of Kaffa in 1346, where the Mongol army reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, one of the earliest known attempts at biological warfare. From there, the disease spread across the Mediterranean and into Europe with terrifying efficiency. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. The Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people, wiping out 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. In England alone, a computer-assisted analysis showed the population dropped from 4.8 million in 1348 to just 2.6 million by 1351, a 46% decline in 3 years. It wouldn't recover to pre-plague levels until around 1550, 2 full centuries later. The global population fell from an estimated 475 million to somewhere between 350 and 375 million. Think about that. A single outbreak erased over 100 million people from the planet. And out of that catastrophe came something we still use today, the word quarantine. During the Black Death, port authorities in Venice required ships arriving from infected areas to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. 40 days. In Italian, 40 giorni. Quarantine. The Third Great Plague pandemic began in 1855, originating in China's Yunnan province. It spread along shipping routes to every inhabited continent, ultimately killing at least 15 million people, with 10 to 12 million of those deaths occurring in British-controlled India. In the city of Canton alone, 80,000 people died in just a few weeks in 1894. But this pandemic also produced a breakthrough. That same year, French-Swiss bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin identified the pathogen responsible, the bacterium that now bears his name, Yersinia pestis. For the first time, humanity could see its ancient enemy under a microscope. The WHO didn't consider the third pandemic officially over until 1960, when global casualties finally dropped below 200 per year. Plagues are terrifying. But the fastest killer in modern history wasn't a bacterium. It was a virus. The Spanish flu of 1918 infected roughly 500 million people, one-third of the world's population at the time. It killed somewhere between 17 and 100 million, with 25 million deaths in the first 25 weeks alone. In India, 12 to 17 million people died, about 5% of the entire country. What made this pandemic uniquely horrifying was its death pattern. Most flus kill the very young and the very old, creating a U-shaped mortality curve. The Spanish flu had a W-shaped curve with a mysterious third spike among healthy young adults, peaking around age 27. Soldiers, workers, people in the prime of their lives were dying at rates no one could explain, and the name itself is a misnomer. The pandemic didn't start in Spain. Wartime censors in countries fighting World War I suppressed news of the outbreak to maintain morale. Spain was neutral, so Spanish newspapers reported freely on the virus, creating the false impression that Spain was the epicenter. The name stuck. Children at the time even turned it into a skipping rope rhyme. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. But perhaps the most devastating pandemic in terms of sheer population loss didn't come from a single pathogen. It came from contact between two worlds. When Europeans arrived in the Americas after 1492, they brought smallpox, measles, influenza, and a host of other diseases that indigenous populations had never encountered and had no immunity against. The result was what scholars now call the Great Dying. An estimated 55 million indigenous people died in the century following European contact, and the population of the Americas collapsed from roughly 54 million to just 5.6 million by 1600, a 90% reduction. The scale of death was so massive, it actually changed the climate. The unprecedented reforestation that followed, as farmland was abandoned and forests reclaimed the land, pulled enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to measurably cool the planet. Historian David Stannard has argued that focusing solely on disease creates a misleading picture. The destruction, he says, was not inadvertent. It was microbial pestilence and purposeful genocide working in tandem. Bringing us to the modern era, HIV/AIDS has killed over 44 million people since the epidemic began in 1981. At its peak in 2004, 2.1 million people died in a single year. Today, roughly 40.8 million people live with the virus worldwide. AIDS-related deaths have been reduced by 74% since that 2004 peak, down to about 570,000 in 2025. And then there's the pandemic we all lived through. COVID-19 has killed an estimated 19 to 36 million people worldwide, with roughly 27 million excess deaths recorded between January 2020 and November 2023. 5 years after being declared a pandemic, the WHO still classifies COVID-19 as a pandemic, though it's no longer considered a global health emergency. So, where does this leave us? Scientists estimate the risk of another pandemic on the scale of COVID-19 at about 2% per year, and that number is expected to triple in the coming decades due to increased risk of zoonotic spillover, where viruses jump from animals to humans. There are an estimated 1.67 million unknown viruses in mammals and birds, and up to 827,000 of those could potentially infect people. The WHO has a name for the threat we can't yet see. They call it Disease X, a placeholder for the next unknown pathogen with the potential to spark a global crisis. It's not a prediction of a specific virus. It's an acknowledgement that the greatest danger may be the one we're not yet monitoring. Organizations like CEPI are working on what they call the 100 Days Mission, developing the capability to create vaccines and diagnostics for a new threat within 100 days of its identification. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: pandemics don't ask permission. They don't wait until we're ready. They have shaped the course of human civilization as profoundly as any war, any revolution, any empire. The only question that remains is not whether the next one is coming, but whether this time we'll be prepared.